Thank you. So I'm Alex Pearlman. As David mentioned, I'm from Boston, though I wasn't at MIT, but I have, as a journalist, written for a number of these venerable publications, and now I'm at King's College doing my master's degree in bioethics. I come from a background of human rights journalism as well as coverage of science and technology, and my interest here is primarily from a human rights perspective, looking at how access to medicine and healthcare is going to be a really significant issue going forward. So for the purposes of this talk, though, I'm going to be talking about CRISPR, which is, it stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. So it's awesome that it has such a sexy acronym. Specifically, this is an enzyme that uses targeting to splice genes and add or remove them from the human genome. There are a number of other kinds of gene therapies out there. There are a number of them that are in use that have been approved and have gone through regulatory standards. This one, however, is very exciting because it seems to not only be easier to use, cheaper to use, but also many scientists claim it has fewer off-target effects than the ones that are already on the market. So this is what we're going to focus on. But before we get into that, something that everyone's very excited about is the possibilities of gene editing the human genome and what we can do to ourselves. So from a philosophical perspective, let's do a little thought experiment. And if your mind isn't already in this space, get it there. And now, obviously, none of these are medically possible at the moment. They may never be possible. But it's just an ideas about what the human possibilities are, right? What if we can make ourselves smarter? What if we can make ourselves better, faster, make our lives more convenient to the futures that we've been talking about? For example, cars, immortality, these sort of things. And then the other question being, if there is a possibility to fundamentally change the human existence to make it better and to live a better life, is it our moral responsibility to then make sure that our children have that opportunity? Well, some people believe that it is, others believe that that's crazy, and this is where we start to get into this debate. So, a little bit of history. I'm American. I live here now. Obviously, I come from a more Anglo-American centric viewpoint, but there are some really key differences between the way those two countries even handle these sort of innovations in biomedical research. So, for example, as you can see, these are three very key areas of innovation that have wildly different responses. And that's for one very important reason, which is that the UK has a regulatory agency that handles this kind of science, and in the US, our science policy willy-nilly depends on who's sitting in the Oval Office, and it changes every 8 years or so. Whether it jumps forward or back depends on who controls the presidency. So unfortunately, that makes it a bit more difficult to pass regulation that sticks. So here's where we are now. I Googled CRISPR, and these were the first headlines that came up yesterday, which obviously shows a really big mix of hyperbole, hysteria, optimism, as well as it's clear that we're talking about a number of different uses and applications of this technology. So we've got a bit about Monsanto, which one of the big considerations for using CRISPR is in livestock and agriculture. That needs to be regulated. Funnily enough, it will not be covered under the GMO laws we've spent the past 10 years arguing about. So those are going to need to be revisited too. Concerns about whether any kind of genetic editing is playing God. And then we've got differences about editing the human germline, which is using CRISPR to edit embryos or early stage embryos or reproductive cells, versus somatic cell editing, which is using gene therapy on cancer treatment, for example, in adult humans or those who are already born. So that's a few different variations on a theme. But to narrow that down, basically the public in general in the US, and I think this really applies to the UK too, is wary of biological enhancement. So the Pew Research organization did a study in July focusing on gene editing, and some really key takeaways from this. So most of the people who were surveyed had never heard of this concept before, but those who had were in favor of using it for clinical reasons. Trend lines tended to fall along religious divides, so specifically those who considered themselves more religious, predominantly Christians, versus those who considered themselves not so religious or atheist, were either in favor or not. But I think a key number is that only 28% of those surveyed overall said that using gene editing to cure diseases was morally acceptable. So that's a really low number. That's lower than we probably think that that number should be, considering that using gene editing for science and for therapeutics purposes, especially in adults who are consenting and already living, that number is quite low. So here's another poll. This one was done by STAT, which is a life sciences publication in Boston and Harvard. So something really interesting here is that you've got these 3 red bars on the right-hand side, which are hard no, we don't want gene editing. But what's really interesting is that those questions where there's the hard no, the question actually contained the phrase unborn babies. It did not say embryos, early stage embryos. It used the phrase unborn babies. So of course, when you talk to Americans about unborn babies, people start freaking out. So of course, hard no. And then we have to ask ourselves, when we talk about polling, how accurate are these results? That said, the blue lines on the other side are yes, and those are questions that had to do with should we use CRISPR for therapeutic reasons. And as you can see, the same people who said hard no on unborn babies said yes for therapy. So when it comes down to the therapy versus enhancement questions and about editing germline cells, most of the public favors gene therapy for clinical use. The majority do not support gene editing in human embryos or germline cells. And this is from the New England Journal of Medicine that studied a series of public policy polls over the past 30 years, and the results really haven't changed that much, although the figures have differed somewhat over the years. So this is my biopolitics grid, and I think that the point that we're coming to when we're talking about gene editing is that it's going to create really strange bedfellows of people who tend to not find themselves on the same side of arguments. So for example, for egalitarian concerns, we've got those who would consider themselves liberals and those who would consider themselves heavily religious tend to be against gene editing because they're concerned about corporatization of science and that there's not going to be an equal access to this kind of therapy, especially when it comes to human enhancement questions. So you've got Bernie Sanders on one side, and then you've got above Hillary Clinton at the top, who we know is in favor of corporatizing really anything. So she's probably going to be in favor of it. Those who call themselves bioprogressives or technical progressives, a lot of the people in this room are probably going to be up there, bio-libertarians. But then it leaves the question of where is Trump going to be and where is this science going to be in the US in the future. So there are 2 possible outcomes that are wildly on the opposite sides of each other. So either Trump is going to be totally against it and join with the sort of Tea Party religious conservatives, no way is this happening, and push science back 20 years. Or is Trump going to go lean more towards a libertarian corporate agenda and no regulations at all, hands off, let it happen, and so we get that sort of right-leaning concern over there. Not to mention, I put him sort of way further because a number of Trump followers, as we know, are white supremacists, and when we talk about gene editing, questions of eugenics come up quite often. So whether he's going to be in favor of it for those reasons and whether his base is going to be in favor of it for those reasons, I put him way over there. So we've got some other, even within our own sort of friends who disagree with each other. This is Zoltan Istvan, who is a leading transhumanist politician, philosopher in the US, who thinks that we should not have any regulations at all when it comes to gene editing. This is Tim Cannon, who's a very well-known biohacker, who also did My Magnet, who believes that we should have regulations and actually stringent ones. So he did a YouTube video, which we'll pass the link around in a bit. I don't think I have time to show it. I also did a poll on my Facebook asking tagging a number of people who I know to be transhumanists, and trying to get a really sort of like cross-section where I've got people of color, people from the LGBT community, people, millennials, up to boomers, all of whom have completely diverse opinions on how to go about regulating this. So some of the takeaways: asymmetrical access will create socioeconomic divides. The concern about equality is only relevant to therapeutics. If people want to enhance themselves, that's their own business. China, that's one guy's argument. The Chinese are doing it, we should all be doing it too. The possibility to eradicate diseases to genuinely help humanity are epic, and we have to do it. It's a moral obligation. Concerns about corporatization, again, if a company could try to patent a new human, how far would that go? And then someone who actually had a genetic cancer that was because of a genetic problem said, if I had the choice now to have it fixed, hell yes I would. It's holding me back from my life. So that was a woman that I know who has the breast cancer gene, who developed breast cancer, and who is an advocate for this kind of technology for that reason. Another concern is, of course, medical tourism, both for patients and for doctors, as we've seen most recently in the US, where a regulation stopped a doctor from being able to perform mitochondrial donation therapy. He just went to Mexico and did it anyway. So that's also a bit of a concern. So, so here it is again. So with Tim on one side, Zolt on the other, and me over there. And you should really think about where you put yourself on this grid, because what's going to end up happening is it's not going to be about left or right politics when we start talking about how mainstream this medicine becomes, and really quickly in the next 15 years, the different points on this grid are going to be the points at which new political parties form. We talked about the Pirate Party. We've got some transhumanist parties popping up, and where even between those people who agree with each other will find themselves on opposite sides of the same divide. And it's going to heavily impact future elections, as well as how we end up regulating this kind of science. So looking to the future, we've talked about the public versus the experts, and yeah, that's a problem, but I think as a journalist, the media, being the middle of that, is incredibly responsible for a lot of the fake news that gets distributed, bad reporting on science, misunderstanding their audiences and what their audiences need. So obviously, more public engagement, and that includes education and functional media. We also need to have more voices heard, and I'm looking out at this audience, and this is not unlike other futurist or transhumanist meetups I've been to. It's predominantly male, it's predominantly white. We need more voices from more communities coming into these debates, because those voices matter, especially when we're talking about the disability advocacies that need to be heard, because patients' rights and disability advocates, and specifically feminist and racial justice opinions, are also widely missing. Again, discussions about experts, absolutely we should let experts helm this debate, scientists and bioethicists, And people who have studied these issues should be leading the debate, but we should not leave out the public. And as we've seen from the polls that I showed, the public is woefully undereducated on this, and we need to engage them and make sure that we have a public who knows what it is that they're voting on, what they're talking about, et cetera. And of course, social justice and egalitarian issues is something I hear about all the time, and the number one phrase that I hear about CRISPR is 1% designer babies. And whether or not that will ever happen, it's something that people are really concerned about, and access is an issue, and we can't forget that. So, thank you very much.
Many thanks, Alex. You get the prize for the best timekeeping so far, so, and fascinating information. A few questions have popped in, some quite tricky ones, I think, as all the questions have been. So, is genetically better always the same as better human?
I don't
After
think
all,
so.
evolution is no respecter of species. Perhaps genetically better tends towards species differentiation. And do we have even the beginning of a politics that can address this?
I don't think so. I think that those are, I think the concept of better is itself a very tricky one that there is no definition for. But from a philosophical and utilitarian perspective, I think the idea is a person's own ability to decide what their own best life is and what better means to each individual in pursuing that. So whether there's a politics or an apparatus that can be used to achieve that, I don't think we have that yet, no.
And where's it going to come from?
I think that's a people-powered question, and I think that's why we need to engage a number of different kinds of audiences in this conversation so that when we say better, are we talking about health? Are we talking about mobility? Are we talking about mental health? These are all questions that I think different groups have different answers to.
Is there a debate in China? When you mentioned that the view is, well, China's going to do it anyway, so we have to follow them. Is there a debate in China, and should we be obliged to follow them if they lead the way?
Yes, there is a debate in China, and actually on this day last year, the National Academies of Sciences hosted a large debate and conference about gene editing and invited a number of Chinese scientists who also are having trouble deciding where their regulatory systems should be. However, they are not confronted with the same level of regulatory responsibility that a lot of our scientists are. And while, yes, there's a debate in China, it's quite a bit easier for science and research to go forward there. As opposed to, for example, in the United States, where government funding is not allowed to be used on embryonic stem cell lines, for example.
I'll take one more question electronically, and then I'll break with the tradition and take a couple of questions from the floor.
Sure.
If people are busting to ask questions the old-fashioned way. So this question is, won't gene editing lead to less innovation as people will, first of all, they'll edit their genes to make themselves more comfortable, and therefore it's going to remove important perspectives which are born from experiences of hardship and challenge. And we're going to end up, doesn't say so in here, I guess like in WALL-E, you know?
I actually don't agree with that at all. I think that there's a possibility that should this go mainstream and it becomes easy for people to enhance themselves for non-therapeutic reasons, that yeah, there's a level at which this kind of changes to the human body might be more like braces or breast implants, something that people do to themselves, makes them more comfortable, makes them happier, cool. But the fact that those things exist doesn't stop biohacking from existing and from people always pushing the envelope on what the human body is capable of, what the human existence is capable of, what that means. And I don't think that innovation will be curbed at all. And we've seen no evidence that any kind of technology that makes us more comfortable has curbed innovation. I don't think that would follow this trend.
So can anybody ask a question in less than 30 seconds? And then I'll...
Presumably animal genetic modification happened first.
Yes.
What are the likely outcomes and where does that come in direct debate on the problems of the human?
Well, for one thing, I think there are two kinds of animal genetic modification that we're discussing. One happens to be about our food chain, and if the GMO debate of the past 10 years is any indication, that is going to be an incredibly difficult debate. Creating regulations for animals that are virtually indistinguishable from their non-edited counterparts is going to be quite difficult. Already, the Newfield Bioethics Council in this country has taken that up as part of their review of gene editing, and I think it's really important. The way that regulators are going to handle that is yet to be seen, and the way that that might bleed into human genetic modifications, I don't know. So yeah, and so that was the other side of it. I was going to say, I actually did know of a guy who is an acquaintance of a friend who is attempting to re-engineer dogs, puppies, to glow in the dark, which originally I was like, what? And then I was like, oh, I really want a glow-in-the-dark puppy. That sounds great. But no, his intention actually is to reverse engineer some of the more worse-off dog breeds that through generations and centuries of terrible breeding practices, those kind of dogs have actually become quite unhealthy. So in an attempt to reverse engineer them to their original healthy state, he wants to be using this kind of gene. So I don't have a problem with that. I'm not sure how that's different or if it should be different from human modification. I think it should be. I think that's a totally different conceptual idea. But I actually think that in the best interest of dogs, that's fine. And if as a side gig, you also, make them glow purple for my daughter, then that would also be cool. Yeah.
Are you aware of any governments that are seeing the economic opportunity here and actually adapting a regulatory framework to encourage people to come and do gene editing research and development work in their country?
So I don't know of any countries that have gone that far. If you know of some, I would love to hear about it. But an example of that, a country that is looking at the economics of this, actually the U.S., on Obama's way out the door, hopefully is going to pass the CURE Act, which was just passed in the House of Representatives, which allots $4 billion in funding for private-public partnerships, a lot of it going to the NIH, a lot of it surrounding precision medicine and Joe Biden's Cancer Moonshot Initiative, both of which draw heavily on genomics research as well as gene editing research for cancer treatment. So I think that there is a economic opportunity there that the U.S. has seen, especially considering the legislation specifically calls out bringing in groups of scientists, and it doesn't specify whether they would be in the government realm or whether they would be private companies. So I think that leaves the door open in a way that makes it flexible and, proves that they have an eye on the economics.
Alex Pearlman, thank you very much.
Thank you.